Okay, gang, it's good to see you all again, and we're doing another interview with a researcher here, and this name is one that I know in Missouri 4-day school weeks, many of you will be familiar with because I was joking with Dr. Thompson here earlier that I can be in the most rural parts of Missouri, and they will bring up his research from Oregon State University, specifically talking about the 4-day school week. So I'm glad to have Paul Thompson from Oregon State here with us, and then we've got Greg Klingensmith, the superintendent up at Warren County Schools in Warrenton, and then we've got Michael Henry, superintendent down at Marshfield Schools. And so they're going to be my helpers on asking questions for Dr. Thompson as he talks about his research on the 4-day school week. So Paul Thompson, give us a little introduction about who you are, what you do, and how did you get into the 4-day school week?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm Paul Thompson. I'm an associate professor here at Oregon State University in our economics department. I've been researching education policy for a long time, basically since grad school. And gotten into the 4-day school week, moving to Oregon. This wasn't something that was on my radar when I lived in Ohio and Michigan, where every school was basically on a 5-day school week. But here in Oregon, over a third of school districts use the 4-day school week model. And so that was kind of my first introduction to this school schedule, and kind of looked around and said, we really don't know a lot about, kind of the impacts of this school schedule. And so, started, here in Oregon, kind of thinking about, well, does this work for our students? What's going on here? And ultimately, I've kind of branched out to look a little more nationwide, to see kind of, each state kind of is doing this a little bit differently. Districts are doing this differently from each other. And so there's a lot of, nuance that I think is important when we look at the research and kind of think about, what are the implications of what large scale research is finding about the 4-day school week, and how can we apply it to our own, small rural districts where these are generally used.
Okay, Dr. Thompson, I'm going to turn you loose here now, and understanding that I've read all your work, and I know that, like you said, you refine it as you move forward. So talk us through the scope of your research, and and you can sort of step us through about how you've conducted your research, what your findings have been, and like you said, I think you mentioned the word nuanced. How has it become more nuanced in most recent iterations of your findings? And so tell us what Paul Thompson and your the folks that you're working with out there in Oregon, what you found looking at the 4-day school week.
Yeah, so where I was most interested in was coming from kind of the economist perspective. When we think about education policy, we're often interested in a couple of things. What are the potential benefits and what are the costs here, right? So kind of thinking about what are school districts hoping to get out of the 4-day school week? Is that actually happening on the ground? And then ultimately, how is this affecting students, right? So, I kind of came to this kind of thinking about how is this affecting student achievement? That's something that a lot of states collect really, nice data on. And so that's where I started in Oregon, kind of thinking about, well, what's the impact of, a school switching to a 4-day school week on student test scores? So that was kind of my first paper around the 4-day school week, looking directly here in Oregon at third and eighth grade through eighth grade students. And what we noticed here in Oregon is that when schools switched to the 4-day school week model, they were dropping a lot of time in school. So around 3 to 4 hours per week was being lost as a way to facilitate, operating a 4-day school week schedule. And when you look at how that loss of time kind of translated into test scores, you see declines in test scores that are almost equivalent to those time in school losses. So, on the order of like, 0.05 standard deviations, which we would say is kind of a small, impact on achievement. It's kind of, a similar scale to losing like 45 minutes of time on math or reading instruction per week, if you want to kind of think about kind of what's the scale of these effects. So, here in Oregon, those achievement declines were kind of driven by, losses in time in school. that we saw for many districts here in the state, right? And so that was something that was kind of interesting to me. Kind of, what are the mechanisms that might drive changes in achievement? We ultimately looked at this more nationally to see, is this a phenomenon we see in other states as well, or other states maybe doing it a bit better? Oregon has some of the lowest state standards in terms of minimum instructional hours, like 900 for, elementary, middle school, 990 hours for high school students, and other states have minimums that are much higher. So we were wondering, is this just an Oregon-based phenomenon, or is this something that's happening, in other states as well? And so we collected some national achievement data, got this for about 12 states that operate 4-day school week schedules. And what we noticed is that time in school is really a critical mechanism here for thinking about the achievement impacts. You don't necessarily need to see achievement declines if you're keeping annual or your weekly time in school kind of relatively consistent with what it was under a 5-day school week, or only losing like an hour or so per week. That seems to be kind of okay for achievement. Students don't really suffer in terms of their learning outcomes when we maintain kind of adequate levels of time in school. But like we saw in Oregon, schools across the country that have very low levels of time in school per week, like 28 to 30 hours per week, those seem to be the districts that are really seeing large achievement declines, even larger than what we saw, in the Oregon specific study. So,
Dr.
a lot
Thompson,
of this recent,
let me stop
yeah.
you right there, because that whole thing that you're talking about there is something we hear a lot when here in Missouri. Dr. Klingensmith, Dr. Henry, any questions you've got on that whole issue of instructional time, and any questions on that?
Well, I would have just a general question of the demographic makeups of those larger districts that have not seen success with the 4-day school week. Generally, what is their attendance like? What is their reduced lunch status? What's their teacher makeup look like? Have they always had retention problems or achievement problems in the past prior to the 4-day week? Just those general type of demographic questions on those larger districts.
Yeah, so, in Oregon, most of these districts were rather small. A lot of these are small rural districts in Eastern Oregon that were often making the switch because high school students were missing a lot of time for like athletics, right? So this was kind of motivated out of high school student reasons. And ultimately, maybe this has implications for younger students, right? If the motivation is like, oh, we're trying to get high schoolers back in the classroom because they're already gone on a Friday for a football game, the Oregon specific paper would say, well, you might want to be worried a little bit about, these younger students who aren't missing for football games, right? So, those type of dynamics I think are important. Like, what are the motivations here? We looked at this for high school students only. And in those rural areas where students were already missing time in school, these large drops in weekly time in school doesn't seem to affect them all that much, suggesting that, this was effective to kind of get high schoolers back in the classroom who are already missing, time already. In terms of demographics, the Oregon schools are really homogenous. These are heavily white districts. The national study, we kind of see some heterogeneity. We do look at Missouri as one of our states, in that 12-state panel that we have. And, it seems to be that across the board, it's really time in school that matters more so than, the size or makeup, the student demographics of these districts. We control for a lot of those different factors. These changes that we see in achievement are kind of taking into account any sort of pre-existing differences in achievement that was happening before the 4-day school week was adopted, right? So, even if schools were already kind of performing poorly, what our estimates would say is that Well, now they're performing even worse than they would have been expected to perform had they stayed on the 5-day school week, right? So this is kind of a comparison to kind of think about, let's compare what we actually observe in terms of achievement for the 4-day school week to what it would have been had that district with the same demographics, same size and things remained on the 5-day school week schedule, right? So what our results would say is that if you switch to a 4-day school week and subsequently change and reduce time in school considerably, this is putting students at a great disadvantage relative to what they would have seen had the district remained on the 5-day school week.
So did the Oregon schools, did they not extend their day? Did they just cut a day out?
So, almost universally, schools are increasing time on the other 4 school days. How long that increases varies widely across districts. We looked at this nationally. We kind of asked all 4-day school weeks, what's your daily start time? What's your daily end time? And in Oregon, we were able to kind of get that before and after the change. And what we noticed in Oregon is that they were really increasing time like 25 minutes per day or something like that, a very minimal amount. Where this is working better is where districts are increasing this by like an hour and 15 minutes on the other 4 school days or even more. So schools that are going, I think in Missouri, the most likely case that we see is 4-day school is going like 8 to 4. And that seems to be a good length of time, putting like 32 hours per week puts you into what we would consider the high range in our national study that don't see any declines in achievement, right? So, if you're going that 8 to 4 p.m. schedule or something close to that, that seems to work really well. These Oregon districts were not doing that. They were not lengthening sufficiently at all. And so one thing, we've been kind of, when we talk to school districts and saying, when they say, what can we do to try to, alleviate achievement concerns? We say, well, trying to keep time as consistent or increasing the length of time on those other 4 school days seems pretty critical here. I know a lot of districts run into challenges of being able to do that. You don't want to start school really early because we know that's bad for student achievement as well. You might not want to go too far into the afternoon because that affects extracurricular activity practice and other things. So there's a lot of challenges for lengthening the school day. But schools thinking about how to do this strategically, finding ways to use that day off for remedial instruction or enrichment instruction for students who are at risk, or the universally for all students. Those are other ways that districts have tried to carve out time and increase instructional time closer to what it was under the 5-day school week.
So you had mentioned that the 28 to 30 was the clear line for seeing decrease. What is the clear, is 32 hours the stable number that you're looking at as far as student performance?
So our high range, like 31 and a half hours or more seems to be kind of the place you want to be if you're looking to not see any sort of reductions. So if you're around 31 hours and above, I'd say you're probably in a pretty good spot. If you're below that per week, if you're in that 30 range or below, that's where we see these big declines in achievement. And so, a lot of those Oregon districts would fit into this low category. Missouri, seems to be doing better about this, whether it's because they were later adopters. The wave in Missouri was much later than in some other states. Maybe, more research was coming out about this when districts were starting to adopt some of these in Missouri as well. So, there's just more information to go off of. And this understanding that, achievement losses can happen if you're not, cognizant of, keeping time relatively consistent. I think, Missouri districts for the most part have been pretty good about this.
What does Oregon do as far as professional learning or professional work opportunities on their 5th day for their staff?
So, we looked at this across the country, and only about a third of districts were doing any sort of professional development, on that day off. A lot of these districts are just like, we're just closed, right? This is, especially for teacher retention, right? Having a day that's like free for teachers seems desirable. So putting too much professional development opportunities could potentially mitigate that benefit. But we have seen some districts kind of use this really intensely as professional development, where something is happening like every week for teachers, right? So I think using this strategically and that day off as like, well, we don't need an early release day, once a month now, because we can move professional development to a Friday, right? That's another way to kind of recapture some lost time that students would normally miss out on. It can potentially help mitigate some of these achievement losses. And at the same time, right, if the 4-day school week is helping to promote additional professional development amongst teachers that otherwise wouldn't have happened, well, we might expect teachers become better over time, right? They learn new strategies, they become more effective, and if teacher quality is rising, right, a lot of research would suggest that that's also going to help student achievement grow over the long run.
And just a clarity question: did your research say you just studied high school scores, or did you do
so
like a 3 through?
Yeah, so the Oregon study was that I talked about before was grades 3 through 8. We had a subsequent study that looked at high school achievement in Oregon. So that was looking at 11th grade achievement. We looked at graduation rates as well. And what we noticed in high school achievement is that these rural areas where students were already missing out on a lot of time in school already because they were at a sporting event or other extracurricular activity on a Friday, most likely anyway, they actually saw positive outcomes from the 4-day school week. Recapturing some of that lost time was really critical for enhancing, 11th grade achievement, increased the likelihood that they graduated on time. But if you look at non-rural schools, suburban, urban schools, generally the larger schools in Oregon that use this, they didn't have that same phenomenon where high schoolers were missing a lot of time already. And so those non-rural students in high school, they saw similar achievement losses that those students in grades 3 through 8 saw. So they saw declines in math achievement in 11th grade. They also saw decreased likelihood that they graduate on time, right? So, this also can affect high schoolers. And I think the motivations and our students missing time already under a 5-day school week, I think is important to kind of think about in like who's going to potentially see positive effects here, who could potentially, feel the full burden of lost instructional time. And at least here in Oregon, rural schools making the switch around this attendance issue seem to get the results that they hoped, right? Rural schools that made this switch, their high schoolers performed better. But then I think we look at the elementary middle school and we say, well, those students were performing worse, right? So is this a net positive or net negative? And what I would say is, well, this could have been mitigated completely if they just increased, the amount of instructional time sufficiently here in Oregon. And they did not generally do that. So we've looked at grades 3 through 8, high school in Oregon, and we also looked at early elementary outcomes. We had some pre-kindergarten assessments, and so we were able to look at students who are more ready for K-12 school. Do they suffer more or less than students who are less ready for school? And what we noticed is that students who are best prepared, both socially and academically for kindergarten, those students were actually most negatively impacted by the 4-day school week, here in Oregon. One thing that might be going on there is that, if schools in Oregon have any sort of off-day programming, it's often of a remedial nature. And so helping those most at risk. And so for those early elementary students, those are going to be the ones that were less prepared for kindergarten, right? So those students seeing better results than the more prepared students suggest that maybe these remedial programs are working to help those students navigate the 4-day school week a bit better.
And also hopefully that very involved parents is very positively impactful to students' education. I hope that's part of that too.
We would hope that, I think we'd hope that, those more engaged parents, helping students become more ready for kindergarten, that would kind of spill over into the 4-day school week as well. For whatever reason, it doesn't appear that that's necessarily happening because we're seeing some of those negative effects for those students who are most ready for school, suggesting that maybe, parents are at home when kids are in pre-K, and then when they enter the K-12 environment, maybe they're back to work or something, right? So there isn't necessarily these same types of supports. There isn't daycare or things available often for K-12 students that there were for pre-K. And so, the environment for childcare is just a lot different when you get to the K-12 setting. And so that could be something that's also going on here, right? Previously they had this supportive environment. Now they're maybe losing that 1 day a week. And so, we're seeing similar declines for those students that we see for grades 3 through 8, or these non-rural high school students as well. So Oregon, we've looked over the entire grade span. For the national studies, we're looking at grades 3 through 8. Again, that's what's available, across multiple states where you can make these multi-state comparisons. But, the Oregon results would say, well, if we're seeing these kind of similar phenomenon happening for grades 3 through 8 for the low time in school, we might expect those same things to be happening that we see in Oregon for the early elementary or high school students as well in places like Missouri or other states.
So Dr. Thompson, I just ask one more question, I'll hush, but
yeah.
As you looked at this, you talked about the discrepancy on hours in class. So Oregon requiring 900 and 990, I believe is what you said. So just as an example, Marshfield. So in Missouri, our minimum is 1,044. Our district saw about 1,085 last year in class. Through your research, are you seeing a sweet spot there, regardless of 4 or 5 days that is kind of rising to the top as far as the amount of hours per year?
So I haven't seen, we haven't looked at this specifically, just what's the kind of, like you said, the sweet spot of annual hours. Generally the research would say more hours are better. More instructional time, if you can get it, is going to lead to positive outcomes. What we do notice is that, at least among the 4-day school week, these states that have the lower minimums, so like Oregon, Idaho, places like that, that have the 990, 900, those are places where there's much more leeway for districts to go really low in terms of hours, right? So, even if you were at, let's say, 1,050 hours as an Oregon 5-day school week, then you make the switch to the 4-day school week, you might say, well, we really don't want to lengthen time a ton because we don't, it doesn't work for parents to have their kid get on the bus at 6:30. We're just going to go to the minimum, right? And so that's pretty easy to do here in Oregon, maybe less easy to do in Missouri with higher minimums, right? So I think it's really on states to kind of maybe look at these minimum hours requirements because that's really the motivator for schools to kind of meet some minimum threshold I know Colorado is currently kind of looking at these minimum hours that they have to see if they want to boost those hours considerably, because if states are seeing lower achievement across the board, that could just mean schools just have too little hours in general, right? So I think these minimum hours requirements are kind of key for getting schools to an adequate level. Missouri seems to be kind of in the middle range. So I would say probably, that sweet spot of, 1080, right? That's kind of in the middle range. And we have a paper that kind of looks at this for 4-day school weeks. And there's such wide variation, across the country in terms of how many hours districts have. And I can probably pull that up here and give you a figure in a moment, but yes, the variation that we see across districts is very high. And so really when we think about, where is the 4-day school week working best, it kind of comes down to kind of how are districts implementing this, because there's many ways that we see districts doing this. Like some have very low hours, but they have an off-day program that doesn't really count in those minimums, right? So how do we weigh that? Others have increased time considerably and don't have an off-day program, right? So I think there's many ways that districts can think about trying to increase hours, keep them close to what they were under a 5-day school week. And I don't think the research knows yet, like what's the optimal way to structure these. I think we're starting to get there, thinking about, well, time is what matters for student outcomes. But is some of these substitutes like a virtual learning day or the off-day program or remedial programming, are these things sufficient substitutes for increasing that day to a sufficient level?
I'd be curious what other factors that you've looked at as that impact student achievement, because when I've looked at our Missouri data over the last 15 years or so, consistently the things that matter the most on student achievement is the free and reduced lunch status of your school district, your proportional attendance, how often kids are coming to school, your quality of teaching staff you have, teachers with master's degree, teachers with years of experience, then how much money your district has, your assessed value per enrollment, and then followed that by mobility rate and discipline rates, and then time of day and number of days in the year, all fall below that. And so for those of us that have to make decisions, because we don't have all of those things, what are we trying to get to? We're trying to retain our teachers, have the best teachers we have the highest attendance we can have, and have the lowest discipline rates possible. That's where the 4-day week has been. Well, we do realize there could be some correlation to lower test scores, but there's more impact by having better teachers, kids coming to school more, and lower discipline rates than the hours in the school year. And so we just make a decision that we're going to go with trying to get the best teacher in every classroom that we can, essentially, is our goal. And have you seen similar results in your studies?
So, I think these are spot on takeaways. If we look at the larger, research on what matters for achievement, what are the key inputs into, like this education production function, teachers are going to be the number one thing that matters the most, right? So, having high quality teachers is going to make the most difference for students, right? So I think schools right now are kind of weighing that trade-off you're talking about, right? It's like we might be willing to have a little bit lowered achievement in the short run to get a high quality teacher in each classroom, right? And so I think we don't know necessarily yet how well that's working. There hasn't been a lot of research out there to say who's being retained in these districts. What types of teachers, are they high quality teachers? Is this working for retention, right? We hear a lot of anecdotal evidence right now kind of saying, oh yeah, our applications are up when we made the switch to the 4-day school week. We're filling some vacant positions. And so I think the bigger question is then, let's look at a larger scale. Is this happening everywhere, or is this kind of a select few districts that are kind of seeing these really large increases in retention or recruitment. This was a similar thing we saw, previously, where a lot of schools were making the change for cost savings, and you heard a lot of stories like, oh, we're saving a ton of money by making this change. We looked at, nationally, how much schools were actually saving as a result of the 4-day school week. And it was like 1 to 2% of their expenditures, which gives them some flexibility. But it wasn't as much as maybe a lot of schools had envisioned when they made the switch around cost savings. So we're kind of in this new environment where we're hearing a lot of, good things like, oh, this is working to recruit teachers. But we don't have a lot of large scale research evidence to kind of say, is this actually happening everywhere? Or if it's happening, what types of teachers are we keeping? Are we keeping the highest quality teachers, in these districts? Because I agree, right? This trade-off could be beneficial if we're able to recruit high quality teachers into places that otherwise wouldn't have as many of those teachers. And long run, right, achievement could rise considerably if the 4-day school week is a crucial way to attract those high quality teachers. So yeah, teachers matter a lot. In terms of student body composition matters considerably. Finances matter a lot for achievement. These studies here have kind of said, well, a lot of those things aren't really changing much. The only thing that's really changing is the 4-day school week. And so if we can control for those other factors and we still see a decline, at least a majority of that decline is probably going to be related to the 4-day school week and these changes in the school schedule, and how often you're in front of a high quality teacher is going to matter considerably as well, right? Even if you can attract high quality teachers, but you're only in front of them for 28 hours a week, right? Achievement could be even higher, right? If they were in front of that high quality teacher 32 hours a week. So I think it's kind of this complement of different inputs that's really going to matter a lot for achievement. But again, teachers are the key component here, and so I think it's a trade-off that for right now districts are thinking is a beneficial one. I think we need more research out there to kind of say, is this happening for everyone? Is this a lofty goal? And then ultimately, I think a big concern for many places is, well, if a lot of the districts around me also switch to a 4-day school week, am I gonna still get those benefits of recruiting high quality teachers into my district? Or is it now coming back to finances, how much I can pay teachers, or is it something about the characteristics of my district that are coming into play? And so the worry, I think, from many states that are starting to push back, and Missouri being one of them, around the 4-day school week, is that if we lose out on this potential benefit, if all the 4-day school weeks, all the districts in a local area become a 4-day school week, our district's going to still get that benefit of teacher recruitment and retention. So I think that's an open question right now as well. Like, what are the dynamics here? Do districts initially get this benefit, and then as more districts in the local area switch, does that benefit go away? And so these are questions I don't know the answer to right now, but hopefully we'll get some answers in the future.
I think as we're talking about retention and recruitment, we have to move that thinking away from recruiting for my neighboring district to recruiting into the profession, because those are two very different things. And yes, at some point, whether it's 4-day weeks or culture, my ability to steal from my neighbors is diminished. But I'm talking, my interest is more about what Dr. Turner has, is people coming into education, the recruitment into the profession. And I think it's really, really critical that we delineate those two issues from each other, because they are not the same.
Oh, I completely agree, right? And I think, a lot of the talk, initially, right, when there's a few districts adopting this, right, it's like, I'm going to try to attract teachers, from other neighboring districts, right? I think as, maybe states kind of make this shift and say we're okay, with 4-day school weeks, we become, majority 4-day school weeks, like we see in Colorado, for example, right? Then it kind of opens up, right, this environment or opportunity to say, right, if I'm thinking about going into the teaching profession, if I'm in higher education, like, should I become an education major or some other major, and say, well, if I get a teaching degree in Colorado, it's probably likely that I end up in a 4-day school week, right? Maybe working 4 days a week is desirable to me, right? So I think for that second effect to kind of really take hold, we really need to know that 4-day school weeks are becoming the majority of the schools in a given area, right? I think it's tough to kind of think about this as bringing new teachers into the profession if you're in a state where there's a low number of adopters, right? So I think Missouri might be reaching that critical point, right, where I don't know, a majority of districts probably in Missouri now are operating on a third or something are adopting the 4-day school week, right? So it's becoming this larger pool of districts, right? So if you're a potential teacher in Missouri, right, the thought of being able to go into a 4-day work week might be really desirable, right? So I think in those states where it's becoming really prevalent, could definitely have those effects, right? But in other states where it's not as prevalent, right, I doubt we'd see those effects, because there's no guarantee you necessarily would end up into a 4-day school week, right? But in states where this is becoming huge, we could definitely see those effects. So I think it's an important distinction to make, and some states are starting to reach that point. But those are much longer run effects, right? So I think some schools right now are thinking like, I need this short-term fix, right? I have some vacancies. I need to get some districts, I need to get some of these things filled so I can, have students have a teacher in the classroom. And those are different motivations than I think maybe kind of thinking, is the 4-day school week long-term a desirable thing to attract more high quality applicants into the larger teaching pool, right? So I think those are two different motivations. And I think some districts might be thinking about these larger scale motivations, but those require a much larger 4-day school week environment in their state to actually, I think, be realized. And so I think a lot of schools, like Texas, for example, are kind of thinking about this in the short term. Like, I have some vacancies, it's been hard to fill teaching positions. Let's try a 4-day school week to see if we can attract some teachers from neighboring districts, into our district, right? So I think initially that's where it starts. Missouri may now be at the point where you're kind of in this second stage, right, where there's this critical mass of 4-day school weeks, and potential teachers are looking at this and saying, yeah, this is attractive. I'm going to go into the education field instead of some other field because I want that 4-day work week.
Okay, I tell you what, we're getting at my 30-minute time range here that I want to be. And Paul, this question is very self-serving. Okay, just last week, I was at a school board meeting in Houston, Missouri, and a school board member held up one of your articles. I don't know which one it was, but held up one of your articles and said, well, this Paul Thompson guy from Oregon State says this is bad for kids. That's literally what he said. Okay. and I'm not
I don't think I've written that down, but
well, I'm not pushing you one way or another. Okay. But Dr. Thompson, I want you to have an opportunity to again, and you've repeated this. I realize this will be a summary of what you've mentioned all through the last 30 minutes here. But I want you to, again, looking at your whole your series of research on this as you've refined your research on the 4-day school week, what is your key takeaway to a school board member, a policymaker, a superintendent about the 4-day week, and specifically how it's going to impact the academics of the kids?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that the benefits that schools are hoping to get is largely to them, right? And we need to weigh those benefits, either cost savings or teacher retention and recruitment, with these potential achievement declines, right? And I would say, our research would suggest there's some key strategies that we can use to kind of mitigate those potential costs around achievement, right? The biggest one, maintaining instructional time. If you're able to do that, our research would suggest this isn't going to be problematic for achievement, right? So, you can at a minimum kind of keep achievement pretty much at the same level. If you increase time, potentially see increases, and also get those benefits you hope, right, around teacher retention, maybe a little more flexibility in cost savings. And so I think the bigger question around the 4-day school week would be, how do we make this kind of a net positive for students, right? What can we do on the 5th day to expand what traditional education has looked like, right? It's kind of this blank canvas for many districts. Some choose to just kind of leave it a blank canvas. Others, I think, have found creative ways to use that to expand what students are doing, right? Where they're not having to sit into a classroom 5 days a week and listen to a teacher. Now we can move all that to 4 days, and you open up this 5th day for experiential learning or job training, job shadowing. You open up the opportunity for teachers to engage in professional development or train new teachers, right? So I think if this is where we're headed in many states, I would encourage communities, school administrators to kind of think outside the box, right? What can the 4-day school week do for us to strengthen our community, strengthen our students, and grow, these students, beyond just a test score, right, as the key outcome, right? We're building, young adults here, right, who are going to be, the next line of teachers or next line of workforce, in our communities. And so I think that's critical, thinking about the whole child, right? Achievement is not the only thing we should care about, right? And I think you're talking to one of my colleagues here, maybe later on, about some of these health effects we've looked at. And so I think there's critical things around, physical activity, nutrition, childcare that are also key things for schools to be thinking about. So, achievement is one part of the story, but there's so much more at play here. And so I'd hope that districts would be thinking about, how can we make the 4-day school week work for all students.
There you go. It's from the horse's mouth. Paul Thompson, Oregon State University. I don't have to, I can now just show the video clip. Thank you, Dr. Paul Thompson, Oregon State University, Greg Klingensmith, Warren County Schools, and Mike Henry from Marshfield. I hope people have found this helpful as we listen to Dr. Thompson talk about his research on the 4-day week.